morning, Garden Oaks. My name is Rick. I'm one of the other pastors here, and it is always an honor and a privilege to get to open up Scripture with you today. So we're going to continue in our series of Ruth, but first, I have a story to tell you from Friday morning. Okay, so Friday morning, I had to do the one thing I know all of us, we just don't enjoy as much, okay? It's that annual physical, and it's the blood work you have to do with that, okay? I can give you a story another time about how I handle needles, but that's not the point today. Have you ever been in that waiting room, okay? And what happens when you're in a doctor's office, right? Nobody talks to anybody, right? Okay. Have you seen those commercials? You know, it's like the Dr. Rick, don't be like your parent commercials. Okay, you know what I'm talking about? I felt like I was living inside of one of those commercials. Like I am an extra in one of these commercials. Because here I'm in the waiting room, it's early morning, there's like 5 or 6 of us, and we're all there for blood work, which means none of us are happy about it. We're all just kind of resigned to our fate of what's about to happen. And there's this one guy, and he is sitting there watching the drug company like infomercial on the TV in the lobby, commenting on the whole thing. It's like a running sportscast, like announcer thing, talking about the name of the medicine and the side effects of the medicine. Listen, nobody cares. We want to see the nurse, do what we got to do, and get out of there, right? And so we're all just kind of hoping this guy's like the next in line to go. And there's one lady who, without even looking up from her magazine, is like cheering them on, like, oh, yeah, I get it. Like, please stop talking. Okay, you ever been in one of those moments? Okay, true confession. I have always feared being that guy. You know, the one who's just totally not aware of what's going on around him and just kind of talking and talking. Here's where that comes into my life, okay? This is where I get the most insecure. When there's a moment in a conversation and I want to bring Jesus into the conversation. I'm not kidding. I feel like that guy. You know, the one that nobody wants to hear what I'm saying. Everyone's just kind of hoping I move on and someone's going to say something nice, trying to, okay, Rick, you're done. It's come on. I live sometimes with that fear and that insecurity that nobody wants to hear, and that quite honestly, I feel like sometimes I don't have the credibility to speak about Jesus. You know, I've wondered why. What is it why would people want to hear? How do I bring up Jesus in a conversation in a way that others want to hear? Because here's the thing, the church has done a lot to help us. The church has tried a lot of different methods, a lot of different things. And, you know, if you look through history of the church, we've perfected our doctrine. Like we know what we believe and we can communicate it well. But that doesn't seem to change someone's mind. We've had generations with revivals and crusades, and yet it really hasn't made much of a difference in the culture. You know, we've grown big churches that have concert-style music and all these attractions, and yet less people are going to church. But how about this? Jesus is now part of popular culture, right? And we have best-selling authors that are pastors, and we have TikTok videos, and even Jesus in the Super Bowl commercials. I mean, come on, that's big time, right? And yet the world remains skeptical. And I wonder, what is it that gives me the credibility to bring Jesus into the conversations that I'm having with people every day? And the way I look at it is there's one question. I believe everybody is asking this one question, and if we could answer this one thing, I think it opens every door. And the question is, do you care enough about me to help me with my hurts? Because everybody's got a hurt. Everybody's got a pain. There's something in their life that is the biggest thing. And before they're ready to listen, they have to know we care. They have to know we're willing to enter into that pain with them. And that is why I love the story of Ruth, because at its core, the story with Ruth and Naomi, it is a story of the hurting finding healing and restoration. So just as a kind of a recap of where we were last week, we get introduced to this lady, Naomi. And she is married to a guy, Abimelech, and they're, starting off life. And there was something about the time period they lived in. This is long ago in Israel's history. And to be honest, it was not a good moment in Israel's history. This was a time marked by disobedience. In fact, there was a cycle. There's about 400 years where the people of God would be very disobedient to God. They would follow other gods and other religions and do things, and life would be kind of bad. There would be famines, there would be invasions, there would be different things going on. And what they would do in their distress, they would cry out to God for a deliverer. And the whole book of Judges is these people inspired by God to deliver the people. And then a time of prosperity would come in, and for about 40 years, life was good. And what we all know is that when life is good, sometimes we tend to forget about God. And they would slip, and they would go back into the cycle of not obeying God, and there would be a hard time. Naomi is living in one of these moments. There's a famine in the land, and the truth is, in this moment, this famine wasn't random. This was a consequence to their disobedience. But Naomi compounds that, and she says, life is hard here. We're going to leave the land of Israel. We're going to leave the God of Israel, and we're going to go to another city, or another country, to another set of gods. And she and her husband move, and her sons, they move, and while they're over there, tragedy strikes. Naomi's husband dies. Her 2 sons die. And now Naomi is left with her 2 daughter-in-laws and nowhere else to turn. So Naomi heads back to to Israel. And as she's going there, one of the daughter-in-laws, Ruth, says, "No, I will go with you. I will protect you. I will take care of you. I will be with you to your dying day." This great act of sacrifice. But as we end chapter 1, Naomi is hurt. She's bitter. She's mad at God because of all the things that have happened to her. So as we get to chapter 2, now we see as they've made it to Bethlehem. They're in the land of Israel, and they got a warm reception there. But the truth is, they're widows, they're poor, and they're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. So as we pick up in chapter 2, what we see here is Ruth is dependent on the kindness of God to survive. So let's start off. We're going to read a little bit here in Ruth 2, verse 2. One day Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go out to the harvest and pick up the grains that were left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Here's what's going on. There's no food. There's no welfare program. The best that she can do to earn a living and to make food for that day was it was harvest time. They were harvesting the barley crop. So what she would do is she would go into the field and follow the workers, and anything they dropped, she would pick up, and that would be their food. Now, here's what I love about our God. You see, he instituted this practice. He actually protected the poor with this practice long ago in Israel's history. In the book of Leviticus, this is from Moses. He wrote this in the law for the people of Israel. It said, "When you harvest a crop of the land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field. Do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners who live among you. I am the Lord your God." He goes even further to explain why in just a few passages. "When a stranger sojourns with you in the land, you shall not do him any wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself." Does that sound familiar to anybody? "For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." I love what God is doing. He's painting a picture. You know, the nation of Israel started as a nation inside of Egypt. They grew as a nation as slaves in another country. They lived as foreigners for the first couple hundred years of their existence. They knew the pain. They knew what it meant to get taken advantage of. They knew what it meant to not have any rights. And God said early on in their law, you will not do that to anybody else. God cared about how the poor, about how the foreigners were treated. This is the kindness that Ruth is now leaning on. When she goes in the field to glean, she is leaning on this kindness and this compassion of God who set it up in the law that you will allow the poor. In fact, they would literally not take the grain from the corners of their property. And as the workers are going through, when they drop something, they're not allowed to make a second pass. That was a provision. See, Ruth was dependent on the kindness of God because Ruth knew her status. She goes in, she's a widow. She has no husband to provide for her. She's a woman in a society where there's not a lot of rights for women. She's a foreigner who has no other rights, and she's poor. She had nowhere else to go but the kindness of others. So let me ask you, have you ever been in that spot in life where life was hard, things didn't go the way you wanted them to go, and you just had to rely on the kindness of others? You know, I know for me, I've never been in the same shoes as Ruth. I've never been in that kind of situation. But the closest I've been was following Hurricane Katrina. I was living in New Orleans at the time when the storm came through. I was in seminary, living right in the middle of the city. And I grew up in that area, and I knew exactly what a hurricane meant. It meant a week off of school. So I packed up about a week's worth of clothes, a few books, I was a good student, and my guitar. I left my computer, I left all this other stuff in the room, and I went up to Tennessee to go visit some friends for the week. And of course, I wasn't able to get back into the city. In fact, it was probably 3-4 months till I got back to a mold-filled room. Not to live, just to pick up stuff. And so from that trip, I had to make it back to my parents' house. I had to move in with them. I had about a week's worth of clothes and had to rebuy clothes, had to figure out school and get a job and, all the things in life that you don't have with you when you leave for a week, right? And I was dependent upon the kindness of others to help me in that season. There's times in life where we're there and we need the support of others. And as we move on to this chapter, we get introduced into a character named Boaz. Now, Boaz is the landowner whose land that Ruth is gleaning from. And as he's going through the land, he takes notice of Ruth. So we're going to read a little bit starting in verse 4. While she was there, being Ruth, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. And Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is this young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is a young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. And she asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters, and she has been hard at work ever since, except for a few moments of rest in the shelter." And Boaz went over to Ruth, and he said, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go the other way in the field. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting and follow them. And I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." You see, Boaz is modeling the kindness of God that Ruth desperately needed. As he goes through, he takes notice of her. He calls her over. He hears her story. And then he does a couple things that are incredible. Remember, this is the time of Judges. I've mentioned that this is not Israel at their best. And he recognizes, hey, I need to protect this lady because there are dangers out there. So he says, hey, stay here and I will tell my men you are protected. They are not to tease you. They are not to harass you. They are not to harm you. And he goes even further and says, you are protected here. You can gather grain here. He says, you can gather the water that my servants have gathered for the workers, and you are welcome to it. Later in the chapter, it's when it's lunchtime and all the workers come in from the field for lunch. She is invited to the table and given food. And then Boaz, even later in the chapter, tells the workers, hey, as you're going through, I need you to intentionally drop extra food for Ruth to pick up. Boaz goes above and beyond. And as you can imagine, Ruth is kind of floored by this reaction, like, why are you doing this? We see in verse 10. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? If you've ever been in a spot in life where you've depended on the kindness of others, there's a lesson here. It is not based on what we deserve. Watch what Boaz says. Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and your mother and your native land and came to a people you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a reward given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you came to take refuge. Boaz notices two things about Ruth. He commends her on two parts. One, the sacrifice she made on behalf of her mother-in-law. He wants to honor that she showed kindness to Ruth. She went above and beyond, with Naomi. But here's the second part. Back in chapter 1, when Naomi is pleading with Ruth to go back to her family, Ruth says, no, I will stay with you. Your land will be my land. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Naomi, in her hurt, because remember, she's grieving the loss of her husband too. She's a widow as well. In her hurt, she turns to the God of Israel. And I love the picture that Boaz paints here. It says, under whose wings you have taken refuge. It is this picture of a bird that covers her chicks with her wings to protect them, to keep them warm, to keep them close. Ruth knew that in her hurt and in her distress, she needed to run to the God of Israel for her support. You know, the truth is, we live in a world where there's hurting among us. That we have the foreigners who live here. We have the poor that are with us. We have the widowed and we have the orphan. We have the abused, we have the neglected. They're part of our city, and I'm going to be honest, they are looking for the kindness of God to intervene in their hurt, to bring relief from their hurt. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, can we do what Boaz did? Can we be a source of kindness? Can we show them God's love through the way that we act and the way that we work to alleviate the hurt and the pain in our society? Because I'm going to be honest, we have the ability to turn despair into hope. We have the ability to turn hurt into healing. But it comes through us displaying the kindness of God into others. So let's continue on with the story, because Ruth has worked a long day. She has worked hard in the field, and then afterwards she has all this grain, and she has to go process this grain to get the final product. And it has been a long, hard day, and then she carries a huge load. It was like 30 to 50 pounds of grain that she carries home to Naomi. Now you can imagine when she walks in the door and has this big old sack, and Naomi just stares at her like, what just happened? Like, how did you get this? And so Ruth is kind of replaying the day, and I, just happened to go across this field, and I met this guy, and his name was Boaz. And she's like, well, wait, who? She's like, wait, I know Boaz. He's a family member. Like, he's one of the people that is meant to help us in our times of distress. But again, time of the judges, we don't know if people are really following the law. And to see, here's a kind man, here's a generous man. She is ecstatic. Now remember Naomi from chapter 1. She is hurt. She's bitter. She's mad at God. In fact, here's what she says. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. That is the Naomi of chapter 1. Now at this point, here's what she says. May he be blessed by the Lord. She's speaking of Boaz, whose kindness, God's kindness, has not forsaken the living or the dead. She goes from the hand of God is opposed to me to he has not forsaken me. What is the only thing that has changed in their circumstance? The kindness of Boaz. It changed everything about Naomi. It changed everything for Ruth. Because our acts of kindness can awaken and it can revive a hope in the goodness of God. And as we even cross over into the New Testament, Jesus taught us that it was these acts of extravagant kindness and how we're to live them. There's this moment he's kind of walking along the way, and one of the religious leaders stops Jesus. And he's going to ask him a question. Now, I'm going to be honest, this question was not with good intentions, okay? The question was, who is my neighbor? And this guy, this religious leader, was asking this question, trying to narrow the field. Okay, Jesus, tell me who I need to be kind to so I don't waste my energy on everybody else. And Jesus answered with a story, as he often did. And he gives this story. There was a man, a Jewish man, walking along the road. And as he's going down the road, he is actually attacked by robbers. And he's beaten up, and everything that he has is taken. And this guy is laying unconscious, half dead, probably will die if he doesn't get any attention. And so what happens? Well, your hope is that somebody will come down the road and help you. Sure enough, here comes a Pharisee, a religious leader coming down the road. And you're thinking, yes, this is the right person. Here's someone who knows God the best. They follow the law. They know God's character. Surely this person is going to help. But yet he steps over and walks along the other side of the road and leaves this man there because he doesn't want to defile himself. He doesn't want to defile any rituals, and he wants to make sure that he is in good standing, ironically enough, before God. And he leaves him. Then the second person, it says it's a temple assistant. It's the associate pastor. It's the worship pastor. It's the chairman of the deacons. They come over. And again, somebody of high stature, somebody who knows the ways of the Lord. But they do the same thing. And then it's the third person who comes down the road. It says is a Samaritan. Now, it may not mean a lot to us, but there is an ethnic rivalry between Jews and Samaritans at this point in time. And it's comparable to anything you can think of around the world today. They hated one another. But yet this man stops. He sees him there. He sees his need. He bandages him up. He puts him on his donkey. And now this guy walks while this guy gets to ride into town, brings him to an inn because they don't have hospitals, but he brings him to a spot of safety, brings him to a spot where he can heal, and then he pays for his stay and he pays for any supplies that are needed for this guy's recovery. And Jesus asked a simple question: who was a neighbor to this man? And that teaching challenges us because it goes much deeper than just doing something right. This man in the story, and then what we see with Boaz and Ruth, they showed extravagant kindness. It went way beyond what was needed or expected to what was just ridiculous. But it shows us something about the character of God. Because one of the attributes of God, and when we say that, we're meaning part of who God is. This isn't like God makes a choice to be kind. It's who he is. It's how he naturally works. Everything he does is filtered through this lens of kindness. And God is showing us through the story of Ruth, through the story of the Good Samaritan, this is what his followers were meant to do. It is this kind of kindness, this extravagant kindness that, quite honestly, it built the early church. You know, in the first 100, 200 years of the church, they lived in a persecuted world. They lived in the Roman Empire, which was a pagan empire. You guys remember your mythology from high school? Okay? That is real. Like, these are the gods they're worshiping in Rome. And the church grew because they were the only ones willing to take care of the sick at their own cost of maybe catching that disease. The Christianity grew because they were willing to pick up the babies in the field that nobody wanted. And there was a letter that was written, the last pagan empire, or the last pagan emperor of the Roman Empire. His name was Julian the Apostate, was the title given to him. And he is mad because he sees the Roman Empire declining. He sees the Roman pagan religion declining because of what is happening in Christianity. And he writes a letter to one of his priests. And listen to what he says. For it came about when the poor were neglected and overlooked by the priest, then I think the impious Galileans, speaking of the Christians, observed this fact, and they devoted themselves to philanthropy. And he goes on. And they have gained ascendancy in the worst of their deeds, though which they credit this win for such practices. When he says their philanthropy, they're taking care of the poor, they're taking care of the sick, it gained them great status in what he calls the worst of their practices. You know what that was? It was the meeting of the church where they did the Lord's Supper together. He said the church grew and it overthrew the Roman Empire because of the way they took care of the poor, the hurting, the sick, the helpless. So how do we earn the credibility to bring Jesus into our conversations in a hurting world? How do I not be like that guy in the doctor's office that no one wants to listen to? Okay? I believe it starts with having our eyes open. We got to be open to the needs around us. Because the truth is, we are around the hurting all day long. And you just look at the story of Boaz. Here he comes in as a landowner. He didn't have to take notice of Ruth. There were other people gleaning in the field that day. But he knew the story. He knew what was going on around town. He noticed her. He asked about her. He even called her over and had a conversation. He was willing to take his time. And it's a busy time of year. There's a lot of work to be done in harvest time. and he took time to notice Ruth. You know, we can try. Here's my worry. We try to systematize things so much, and we're like, okay, what should the church do about this? And it's not a wrong question, but I don't think it's our first question. Sometimes like, hey, what should the government do about this? And it's not a wrong question, but I don't think it's the first question. I believe the first question we have to ask, what should I do about this? Because the truth is, if we do our part, and I start looking at what do I need to do? What has God called me to do? How do I show extravagant kindness to those around me? Here's the truth. As each one of us do this, the world will notice. The world will take notice, and they will see what we, the Christian church, is doing. It doesn't always have to be a program. Sometimes it is just us living out the character of God and seeing the hurt and meeting the need that God has put in front of us. So the first thing I ask, if we're going to have credibility in this world to speak Jesus into our conversations, be open to the needs around you, and then be extravagant in showing kindness. Let me ask you this way. What kind of kindness did God show you? Did he show you kindness in proportion to what you deserved? Did God show you kindness in proportion to your worthiness? No, of course not. Praise be to God, he didn't. Like, he showed me abundant kindness. He showed ridiculous kindness. Like, he did not need to do what he did. I love what the Apostle Paul tells us. While we were utterly helpless, Christ came at the right time and died for us sinners. Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though some may perhaps be willing to die for a person who's especially good. But Paul says, but God showed his great love by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. This is what we get to model. We get to show kindness to the world not based on anyone's status, not based on their ability to repay, but we get to show kindness that is simply based on the character of our God, who goes above and beyond and extravagantly blesses, who shows extravagant grace, and who shows kindness in ways that most people will quite honestly think you're a little weird for doing. Fair? We earn the right to introduce others to Jesus by showing extravagant kindness that awakens hope in the goodness of God. Now, I'd love to invite the band to come back up. And as we wrap up, I want to take a moment to reflect on this story. You know, there's three main people we've talked about. You have Ruth, you have Naomi, and you have Boaz. Take a moment and think, which one of these three do you identify with the most right now? Maybe it's Boaz. Maybe life is going well. You're in a time of prosperity, and you have the ability to keep your eyes open, and you have the ability to extravagantly bless others in showing kindness. Perhaps you're more in the position of Ruth. Life is hard. It just is. And you're working hard, you're trying to make ends meet, but the truth is you know you can't do it on your own. You are dependent on the kindness of others to make it happen. And I want to encourage you, learn from the lesson of Ruth. Put yourself under the wings of God. Trust him. Lean in on his kindness. And perhaps life's hard. And perhaps you're more in the spot of Naomi, that you've just had tragedy after tragedy. And right now, if you're being honest, you're actually kind of mad at God. And you're not sure what to do about that. And this is what I would encourage you. Release your hurts to God. It's so easy when we get into that spot, and it's honest. It's okay to tell God you're mad at him. But our tendency is to isolate. Our tendency is to pull back and to shut ourselves away from others and from God. I just ask, be open. Allow God the chance to show you his kindness, even in the hardest spots. Allow a chance for the people of God to rally around you and support you. So as we close out, I challenge you. Let's earn the right to speak about the love of Jesus by showing kindness, by showing compassion in the hurt and the pain that is in everyone's life. Let us earn that right through showing the character of God. And we're going to do this at the end of service. We're going to have some time to pray. We're going to have some people up here, a prayer team up here. If this is you and this is just a hard spot in life, we would love to pray with you. I'll be out down here. I would love to pray with you. And we have this time. If you want to hear more about what does it mean to follow Jesus, maybe this idea of God's kindness is a little weird and you're just not quite sure, you've never experienced that, come down. We'd love to pray with you, love to talk with you.